Good evening and welcome to Enemy Within. This is peoplesinternetradio.com and it's Friday the 23rd of October 2015 and I'm Andy Young, or so they keep telling me. And we're in freezing cold Britain. I've been digging out my thermal underwear today. But tonight we are very lucky that I've got Jason with me again and we're joined by Lenon Honor. Lenon Honor is a husband, father, writer, lecturer, musician, video producer and counsellor. He and his wife have been in a positive relationship for 14 years and have 5 children together. His website is lenonhonor.com and has provided a wealth of information and inspiration in regards to manhood, fatherhood, marriage, children, family and personal growth. Lenon is the writer of 5 books. The first, Writings for Fathers of the World of Tomorrow, was written to inspire current and future parents and to encourage healthy relationships between fathers and sons. The second book, Deep in the Garden of Consciousness, delves deep into metaphysics, spirituality and consciousness. His third book, 9/11 Fear-Based Mind Control Program, reveals how mass media has turned the trauma of September the 11th, 2001 into a tool of psychological warfare. His fourth book, titled 360 Inspirational Quotes, is a wonderful resource for anyone who is actively pursuing their own personal growth and empowerment. And his fifth book, Pregnancy Support, was written to provide women and men with the information that they will need to prepare for pregnancy, labour and birth. Lenon has produced 8 major documentaries to date. Film topics include spirituality, religion, media manipulation, mind control, subliminal manipulation, transhumanism, the occult, politics and the entertainment industry, and other salient topics. All of his films can be reviewed on his website, lenonhonorfilms.com. Now that's quite a build-up, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to Lenon. Are you with us, Lenon?
I sure am. Good to be with you, brother. Good to be with you.
It's great to speak to you. And are you well as well, Jason?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you doing, Lenon?
Oh, good. Good, doing well, Jason. Thank you as well. I know we had scheduled this for a couple of days ago, and I messed up my schedule, so I apologize. I'm glad that we were able to work it out for today.
No problem. We're fairly flexible. And I believe, Jason, you've got something you'd like to ask Lenon to start with.
Yeah, well, I mean, I first came across Lenon's work about 2 or 3 years ago, and I bought his book as well, which is the 911 Fear-Based Mind Control Program, which is a fantastic book. It shows how the media is using the 9/11 story to manipulate people and to sort of get onto people's fears and stuff as well. So I've known of Lenon's work for a couple of years, but there is such a huge body of work that it's difficult to know where to start, really. I mean, there's subliminal messages, there's media manipulation, there's positive relationships. I know he does a lot of work with his wife as well, doing a lot of videos. He's got 5 lovely children. I believe that you homeschool them, don't you, Lenon?
Yes, we sure do. Mm-hmm.
You homeschool all your children. None are vaccinated, and I believe you delivered. Well, most, if not all.
Yes, we can say most. 3 out of 5.
3 out of 5, yeah. And at the moment, Lenon is working on a documentary about NWA. But before we sort of go into that, I saw a video from, I think it was 30th of September last year. I actually think that I sat up and watched it live. And it was Media Manipulation episode 50, and it was about race, religion and sexual orientation and how those manipulations occur in the media. So what I wanted you to do, first of all, is because it actually blew me away. So I wanted to, first of all, just for everybody that's listening, to just get your take on race and how it's how the manipulation and how we're all sort of divided up and put into different compartments, but then sort of stamped with a generalisation, if you will.
Yes, yes. The concept of race as a scientific concept, it is not legitimate. However, it doesn't mean that the outgrowth of this particular concept is unreal. It doesn't mean that it's unreal. In other words, race as a concept is a modern day invention. Prior to the 1600s, if you told someone I'm of the black race, they would not know what you were talking about. If you said I'm of the white race, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. If you said I was of the yellow race, they wouldn't know. If you said you were of the red race, and all these various delineations, people wouldn't have no idea what you were talking about. So it's a very much a more modern day invention, but it's not scientific. As an example, race today, what most people associate with race and how it has been propagandized has to do with genetics, skin color, skin texture, phenotype. That could be, let's say, your nose size, your lip size, all these different types of things. But none of this is scientific. In fact, if you go into Africa, and you can go into any period in Africa, you would find people who had various different complexions of skin color, hair textures, nose sizes, lip sizes, and what have you. You can go into different places in Europe, and people have different features, very different features. In fact, for those of y'all who have not been to Europe, recently I was in, and this is just, I guess we can say here, this is in 2015 as an example. I was in London. And we have this misconception here in the United States that somehow everyone who lives in the UK or they're of the white race and they must all be the same. That's not the case. In fact, if you go to London and you talk to different people, you can tell everyone looks different. All different types of people there. It's a metropolitan type of a dynamic. But even amongst people that we would call European, they don't call themselves white. They don't say I'm a white person. In fact, they are very specific. They will say I'm from let's say. I'm from Norway. I'm Norwegian. Some may say I'm from Eastern Europe, and they'll give you a particular country, and then they may even give you something even more specific for you to think about in terms of their identity. The problem with race is that it provides a generalized orientation, and so there's all different types of groups of people who have different cultural backgrounds, different languages, different cultural practices, even different belief systems, and you put them all into one category, and based upon those categories, it's somehow scientific. That all of those people have a certain type of cultural background. All of those people in that particular group or that particular quote-unquote race, they have a certain skin color or a certain hair texture or a certain nose type or lips type or what have you. That's what I mean. It's not a scientific concept whatsoever. The problem is, though, that the concept itself, it was derived out of the need to set up a hierarchy wherein African people, indigenous people, in particular Africans, were at the bottom of the totem pole, and therefore the legitimization of the enslavement of those African people, or those indigenous people, was now validated. In other words, if you can set up a dynamic based upon this concept of race, which is an illusion, but you set up this dynamic, and then based upon the concept of race, you set up a hierarchy, the people who are at the bottom now you can justify the enslavement of those people because they are subhuman. Even look at the term as an example. I can go on this topic. It's a fascinating topic. The word race itself, prior to the 1600s, did I say 1600s? Yeah, 1600s. Prior to the 1600s, if you ask someone what was a race, they would specifically tell you it is a sporting competition where two people are running against each other and they're in competition with each other. Okay, and that's what a race is, so it makes sense. But just imagine if you use that same term and now you apply it to this concept of differences amongst the species where you can lump different groups of people into one category, like white people or red people or black people or brown people or yellow people, what have you. But still, the concept of race is based upon a competition. So if now you set up this dynamic of quote unquote genetic hierarchy of these quote unquote races, now what we're talking about is competition amongst the races. The term itself implies that it's a competition, and that in and of itself is a problem. So what I'm saying here is that the concept of race is an illusion, the concept itself. The problem, though, however, is that so many of us have bought into this illusion, and it has us buying into it as a species has had dire consequences in terms of the social structure, especially here in the United States of America, the political structure, the economic structure, all the way across the board. The concept of race plays a major role. I want to say this too, and that is that we don't teach and we live a different life, my wife and I. Okay, we don't vaccinate. We're vegan. We homeschool our children. There's a lot of things that we do not do, and there's a lot of things that we do because we're raising our children in a different way than how we were raised. We're trying to do better. One of the things that we do not teach is the concept of race. Now, I can consider myself to be an African American, but that doesn't mean that defines who I am per se. Okay, I have a particular experience as an African American male that I can relate to other African American males for the most part, and they can do the same. But the notion of me applying that identity onto my children prior to them having a life experience, in my opinion, it does a disservice, because I don't want them to feel as if they have to they have to define themselves based upon this concept of race that is not scientific in the first place. And so this is just an example, and that's why race in terms of media, because it is a competition. The way that it's structured, it's a genetic competition between those of the superior race, quote unquote superior race, and globally these days it's considered to be white people, and those of the inferior races, that goes all the way down to the bottom of the totem pole would be the quote unquote black race. That concept in and of itself is so divisive and so destructive to the human species. And what mass media does is whenever a racialized story comes out, especially in the United States of America, it jumps on that particular story. And the reason why is because there is so much abuse, trauma, pain, injustice that is taking place here in the United States of America for almost 400 or over 400 years now, that to bring up the concept of race, it stimulates those same types of trauma, same types of pain, suffering, so forth and so on. And there are a lot of people who, when that trauma is summoned, they have emotional reactions, and therefore they want to engage that particular topic. And so and I've already talked about this in past live video streams, where I've talked about the three main issues that media tends to focus in on happen to be race, religion, which is tied to terrorism. Again, these are all emotionally charged topics. Race, religion, which also includes terrorism, and sexual orientation. And sexual orientation as in gay rights, so forth and so on. And the idea is that if you can put forth stories that triggers people's emotional response, the people will be more inclined to engage in the story, but their reactions will not be based upon intelligence. Their reactions will be based upon emotions, and that in and of itself is a problem. So I don't know if I answered the question, or maybe I over-answered the question.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way that you can really over-answer a question on this particular issue. Anyway, I was interested. You mentioned that in Europe, that people describe themselves as Norwegian or Spanish or
French, yes,
French or English, yes, or whatever. Whereas, yes. do you think that when it comes to the United States, because they're all it's the United States of America, so it's all different states, which is we've not got here in Europe. Do you think that the issue of race is more important in the United States than it is, or it's more divisive in the United States than it is in Europe?
Yes, I would say yes, and mainly because of historically what has taken place to enslaved Africans here in the United States, the type of treatment, but even after the so-called African enslavement ended, we can look at the black codes, we can look at Jim Crow, these types of experience here in the United States of America. The issue of race, there's so much trauma and abuse that's associated with it that goes back to African enslavement. A lot of that has gone unresolved, and that's why still to this day the issue of race is such a major issue that tends to stimulate a lot of negative emotions, not just for African American folk, but for quote unquote white people and other groups of people as well. And I think that dynamic doesn't play itself out as much in Europe, at least from my vantage point. In fact, my wife and I, we've talked about this over the years. For whatever reason, people from Europe have tended to be very supportive of our work. And when I say people from Europe, what we're talking about is what, if those same Europeans were here, we would call white people. And we found that to be fascinating, right? Like why is it that when I do radio shows, the vast majority happens to be people in Europe, and it's quote unquote what we would call white people if they were living here, if they were raised here. And I think part of it has to do with there's a different orientation that people have in Europe when they see quote unquote African Americans. I'm not saying that their perception is perfect, But compared to how, in general, this is a generalization, how quote unquote white people here in the United States of America, there is a tendency to have a very negative stereotype that is associated with African American people, in particular African American males. And I'm not saying that white people here in the United States of America have not been supported, because they have, but my wife and I, we have noticed that there tends to be somewhat of a difference in terms of the level of support that comes out of the UK for whatever reason. We found it to be quite fascinating.
That reminds me a little bit of something that I experienced when I was in Spain. I lived out there for a few years and moved back to the UK a decade ago. I was often asked, where do you come from? Because I spoke a little bit of Spanish, but strangely enough, my Spanish was in a Russian accent, so everyone guessed that I came from Russia, and no, guess again. And eventually when we got down to, yeah, I'm from Inglaterra, they just shrug their shoulders and go, it doesn't matter, we're all European. Now that is an attitude you don't tend to get amongst the general population in this country. And I found that most refreshing, and I wish there was a little bit more of that going on.
Yes. Well, that would be ideal. I will say this, and again, the concept of race as a scientific concept is an illusion. Okay, mm-hmm. People just have to become clear about that. But this does not mean that this illusionary concept has not had a dire consequence socially, politically, economically, and all the way across the board. And that's to say that racism is real. The concept of race is an illusion, but racism, the expressions of the notion that a particular race perceives itself, or a person of a particular race perceives his or herself to be superior to other races, that is a very real phenomenon. We would hope that at a certain point as a species we move beyond it, and that's why with my own children, my wife and I, we're very clear. We're not teaching them the concept of race. We are teaching them, and they will learn that racism exists, but the concept of that they have to abide to the concept of, or the idea that they have to abide to the concept of race is not something that we are promoting. Now, if they do decide to do that when they come of age, then we'll support them on that. But we're not going to impose that upon them at this point in their life.
Mm-hmm. I did warn you before we started, Lenon, that we would get a few questions from the chat room, and the first one that I've picked out, we got one from Mark, who's regular on this chat room in this show and often helps out with the show, and he asked, what's Lenon's take on Planned Parenthood and the IQ test to label as morons within the black community? Bill Gates' dad was one of the founders, if nobody knows.
Yes, Planned Parenthood, you'll find this is even here in California. A lot of the Planned Parenthood offices were located, and I guess they're still located they tend to be located in areas of where impoverished people live, and most of those impoverished people will happen to be African American people. Okay, this is a statement of fact that people have to be clear about. Mm-hmm. And what I would say in terms of Planned Parenthood is that part of that agenda is population control, but then also population reduction within these African American, in particular, impoverished African American communities. There's a lot of research on this. There's been documentaries that have been produced in terms of Planned Parenthood. The point that I would probably hope that people would take away from my commentary on Planned Parenthood is that ideally, what is most important is for two people to establish a positive relationship prior to getting pregnant. Okay. The notion of going to some institution where they don't necessarily give you a plan for parenthood per se, but rather a plan to either well, I guess you can just one of the major things, I just have to say it, it's hard even for me to say, part of that agenda is it deals with abortion. And creating dynamics within these impoverished communities where abortions are more accessible, and as a consequence, more standardized as a more standardized practice. So part of what I'm saying is that one of the things that my wife and I, we tend to do is prior to people getting to that point, it can be someone who is a young girl who's pregnant. The idea is to provide them with the tools to establish a positive relationship in advance of getting pregnant. Okay. In other words, this is a solution to that particular issue. I don't see Planned Parenthood as being a solution. I see Planned Parenthood as a part of an agenda for population control and population reduction, in particular within the African American community and I should be more specific, the African American community wherein impoverished people reside, i.e., quote unquote, ghettos. So that's my take on Planned Parenthood. As for the IQ test, there's a lot of commentary out there about the IQ test as being here's that term again, racially insensitive. Mm-hmm. In other words, let's use the term culturally insensitive, that there are cultural dynamics present in certain communities wherein even the language that people use on a day-to-day basis doesn't correlate to the language that is present in IQ tests, and therefore a person who is not used to the language of IQ tests because they're growing up in communities where in particular that type of language or verbiage is not used, they're now at a disadvantage. It doesn't mean that the individuals who don't use the language that's on the IQ test aren't intelligent. It doesn't mean that they can't have reasonable, rational, and intelligent conversations. It simply means that they are at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to understand certain language. And so the IQ test puts a lot of African American folk, I'm just talking about people here in the United States of America, African American folk at a serious disadvantage, because in terms of the dialects that are often spoken within the African American community, it doesn't necessarily correlate to the language that is used for IQ tests. Let me say one other thing, though, however, that this does not excuse African American folk from the need for us collectively to continue to evolve our vocabulary, which is something that I did over many, many years. And I will tell you that it has been one of the most important things that I have done in my life. This is to say that if I went into the hood and I was talking to someone, I can have a conversation in that quote unquote dialect with that person, and we can talk, and it will make perfect sense to me what they're saying, and they'll understand what I'm saying and go right back and forth, no problem. I can use that language, not a problem at all. But I also recognize at a certain point in my life that I needed to develop my vocabulary to such a degree to where and I can communicate beyond that particular paradigm, and it has served me very well. I don't know if that answers the question or not, or maybe I over-answered again.
No, not at all. I mean, as far as IQ tests go, I mean, I think they are useful to a certain extent, but they are very divisive, and they allow people with certain types of brain function to get ahead of the rest. I mean, I took an IQ test for, what was it called, Mensa, the Genius organisation or whatever it was, and I took it about 4 a.m. after spending a long night in the pub and consuming lots of beer. I did it in half the time allotted, and I was in the top 1% of the population, allegedly. I wasn't functioning very well at all when I took that. I just happened to be very good at those kind of tests and public school examinations.
I just imagine if you had gotten some rest, you would have probably been in the 0.001%.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
I just wanted to make a point to what you were speaking about earlier on about how African American people are not the way that they're brought up, and the people that they're surrounded with their peers, but also the media manipulation also comes into place, because you will see that on television programs, films, and things like that, African American or black people are expected or portrayed as speaking in a particular way. Do you understand what I mean? So,
Oh yeah.
So the people that are watching and consuming that media, if they're black American, if they're African Americans, then they think that is the way that they're expected to speak and talk. Sorry, go on.
Yes, and there are some that will. In fact, one of the dynamics that we find here, especially in the United States, again, we have a long history here in the United States of America of racial oppression. And a lot of people don't like talking about it, and a lot of people don't like admitting it. It's a very uncomfortable topic, but it is the truth. We just have to do the research and do the study and be honest with our findings. There's been a long history with that. And one of the challenges, I think, is that people simply don't know people. In other words, in the absence of really knowing a person or even a group of people, it's easier to accept a stereotype about someone, because the stereotypes, it allows you to feel comfortable in this, with a sense that somehow you know them, good or bad. The stereotype can be a negative stereotype, but at least you know what that person is or what that person is all about. But it's all based upon a negative stereotype that isn't even based in reality. And in some cases, this can be a positive stereotype, and you may take that stereotype and apply it to all of that group of people. And then in your mind, you may begin to think that you know that whole group of people, or that, all of those people, but you really don't. So this is where stereotypes come in. The problem here in the United States of America is, in terms of media manipulation, is there has been a long-standing history within the media wherein negative racial stereotypes about African American people or black people is the preeminent theme. And you can look in terms of the African American woman. This is so I can stay on task. African American woman, and then there's also these general stereotypes that are widely accepted here in the United States of America about African American men. Okay, let me give you 3 for each. It's going to be a little bit harder for me to think. Okay, so here's African American women. Mm-hmm. One of the major propaganda pieces or media mind control aspects that is presented in terms of a negative stereotype about African American women is that African American women they have a lot of babies by a lot of different men. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people who buy into that illusion. They accept it as being the truth, and they associate that negative stereotype with African American women. Now, are there some African American women who have had that experience? Absolutely. But is that to say that all African American or most? Absolutely not. Okay. So in other words, this speaks to this issue of sexual irresponsibility, sexual promiscuity. Okay. This is where this particular racial stereotype comes through. Now, let me just add another dimension to this particular one. Sexual promiscuity, a lot of that propaganda and programming goes back to African enslavement, wherein there were slave masters, in particular white slave masters, who would have relations and in many cases rape African American women. And the way that they raped African slaves, women, okay, they raped them, and as a justification for this egregious act, they simply said that, well, these African slaves, okay, what we would call nowadays African American women, okay, free women now, but back then African women slaves, they were sexually promiscuous. Okay, so it's a justification. This same racial stereotype still tends to be applied these days in terms of African American women. That's one example of a negative racial stereotype. Another one these days is that African American women are ultra masculine. And this comes out of the notion that they have had to be ultra masculine and take on masculine characteristics because they haven't had African American males in their lives to kind of balance that dynamic out. So they kind of overcompensate. So you hear a lot of the propaganda all the way across the board in media about African American women being ultra masculine. And of course, living in a sexist society, this another dynamic is that African American women are simply not intelligent, which is simply not true either. This lack of quote-unquote intelligence also was one of the justifications for African enslavement. A lot of this stuff goes back to long-standing propaganda to justify the enslavement of African people, but they're still to this day, these same types of racial stereotypes still play themselves out to this day. Okay, African American men. Let me give you 3 real quick. I'll do it very quickly. Number 1, criminal. That we are all criminals. We are criminal-minded. In fact, this criminality is tied to a lack of, a lack of civility. We are uncivilized, and therefore they need to be enslaved. Okay, so this even goes back to old propaganda about enslavement of African folk. But we can also look at it nowadays in terms of the propaganda about criminality. They're uncivilized. We don't enslave them per se, but we will incarcerate them, which is really a form of slavery too. So that's one of the main racial stereotypes about African American men, that we are not dedicated fathers. Okay. In other words, we are not there to take care of our children. We abandon our children. There are many that do, but it shouldn't be accepted as a socialized norm, nor should it be accepted as a stereotype, not by any stretch of the imagination. I know plenty of African American males who are very good fathers, myself included. But that particular propaganda piece continues to perpetuate itself in mass media to this day. And I'll give one more. African American men are lazy. They are shiftless. They don't want to work. These types of things. Well, this comes out of a lot of the propaganda, even the fascinating, just a paradox here. You know that white slave owners would say things like the reason why we have to abuse and inflict extreme physical pain and abuse on our slaves is because they are lazy and shiftless. And yet these are the same slaves who would work, have to get up before sunup and work until sundown. And every 7 days a week, 365 days a year without pay. And yet they're the ones who are lazy. Okay, so again, there's so many paradoxes here that we can even consider. The point that I'm making here is that when we talk about negative racial stereotypes, this is just three. There's plenty of other ones. These are three for African American men that still perpetuate itself to this day. Same thing in terms of African American women, still perpetuate themselves to this day, and mass media plays a major role in perpetuating these negative racial stereotypes about African American men and African American women.
Do you think that race and religion are sort of becoming as though you can't really tell one from another? Because particularly over here, we get Muslims are demonized terribly, absolutely terribly. We've got this immigrant issue that's going on. People coming from Syria, where we've obviously bombed, so they've got no home and where they're going to go anyway. But the religion now, it's like before you would get somebody who'd be racist and perhaps say something about somebody who was a different colour, someone who's black or somebody who's Asian, but now it seems that religion as well has been brought into it. So Muslim is also it's as if it's become another type of a race, if you understand what I mean. But yes. Because people like Arab people, anybody that looks Arab, we get Sikhs in this country, people from India who get called all sorts of names because people think they're Muslim, because they can't tell the difference, because they look similar. So what the question is do you think that the race and religion are sort of morphing into being the same manipulation device, if you will?
Yes, well, it always has been, especially with Christianity. It always has been. You had, like Ham, the cursed race. Well, a lot of people associate that cursed race with black people or African American folk or Africans. so the race and religion, they go hand in hand. I mean, they really do. In fact, one of the ways that African enslavement was sold was through the Roman Catholic Church. People need to think about that. Okay. In other words, it was sanctioned by the popes of Rome. It was literally sanctioned. So if it's sanctioned by the Pope, what does that say? Well, that says that race is a major component to religion, and vice versa. Religion is a major component to enslavement. In fact, there were African slaves who were told by Catholic priests that somehow them being enslaved was the will of God. Well, that's another example. And you should be thankful that you're enslaved, because basically this is God's will. God wanted to take you out of your status in the humans as a human species of barbarism or being a barbarian, uncivilized. This is a way to civilize you. This is God's will. So what I'm saying is that race and religion have gone hand in hand from the beginning. And then when we talk about terrorism, I'm using the term terrorism because when even terminology like war on terrorism, how are you going to have a war on something that is not tangible? In other words, if I said, where is terrorism, you would not be able to say that. So if you say I'm going to have a war, let's say I'm going to have a war with Germany, I'm going to have a war with Iran, that's a very specific place. You can say I have a war with, South Korea, whatever. You can say it's a very specific place. But if you say, and you can also say it's a group of people. You can also say that there's a government there. Okay. You can also say they have an army if they have an army. But you can literally, there is something tangible that you can associate that war with. But if you say war on terrorism, it's intangible. There's no way that you can define what that means. In other words, there's ambiguity there, and you can apply this war on terrorism to anyone as long as they fit within the scope of quote unquote a terrorist. But that could be anyone. And the problem is that what most people see when you say terrorism is they see someone from the Middle East. Right? They see someone from the Middle East. This is another, because I've been reading this, I just finished this book, just about an hour ago. As a matter of fact, The New Jim Crow, by Michelle Alexander. And one of the things that she talked about, inside the book was how, people's perceptions, when you bring up words like terrorism, what comes to mind? If someone said, there's a terrorist, imagine there's a terrorist right in front of you, and then you ask, okay, well, what do they look like? Most people are going to think of someone who's from the Middle East, a Muslim, and they're going to associate that person with the terrorist. But she also talked about how the war on drugs, here's another thing, war on drugs, that's not a person, place, it's a thing, but it's not a person or a place. It's not very tangible because you can apply a war on drugs to anyone at any given time. There's ambiguity there. But she says, okay, the war on drugs, really, that's a war that was perpetuated against poor black people. Okay, and so therefore there's a racial component to this. And so if people say, I want you to imagine someone doing drugs and they're a criminal, I want you to imagine what do they look like. Here in the United States of America, most people are going to think of an African American male. You see, so what I'm saying is that the perception that people tend to have, and so whether that is the war on drugs or the war on terrorism, the same rule applies, that the perception, because of media manipulation and media programming, we associate terrorism with anyone that looks like someone from the Middle East, or if they have a head wrap on, even they might even be from the Middle East, they can be from India, but if they have their head covered, or if they wear a particular style of clothing that may not necessarily even be associated with Islam or what have you, automatically people assume that somehow they are a terrorist, or that somehow they are a pariah, if you will. So the point is, and I hope I've answered the question, is that even the war on terrorism, the language, the verbiage there is indicative of a greater agenda, which has little to do with terrorism. It has more to do with the demonization of people from the Middle East, or people who are associated with being from the Middle East. Okay, and the reason why that's relevant is because the demonization of people, whether that is through the war on drugs or the war on terrorism, is not in the best interest of the species per se. It can serve a political agenda. It can also serve a social, political, or even an economic agenda, if you will. But in terms of being in the best interest of the human species, it's never in the best interest of the human species. I hope I've answered the question.
Yeah.
Well, I think that just about covers it, doesn't it, Andy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, an interesting point raised by Mark. I knew he'd be on the ball with this one. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you were by default a barbarian. You're either against the terrorists or with the terrorists. And we all know where that comes from.
Yes.
So,
they actually said, was that exactly what they said? You're either with them. Oh.
I believe so, yeah. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you were a barbarian by definition. Therefore, you're either with us or you're against us. There's no kind of
it's
ambiguity.
the George Bush thing, isn't it? I mean, George Bush said that, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, he
You're either with us or the terrorists.
That's about the terrorists. Yes, but isn't that interesting? Okay, because what Rome was doing was that they were demonizing other groups of people. Okay, and these are the same people that these days we would say these are quote unquote white people. So, but even Rome demonized these people. And that's fascinating to me. See, that's the interesting thing about world history, is that you really realize that the concept of race, I mean, even amongst what we even perceive to be a group of people, race, there was still all of this internal conflict that didn't have anything to do with the quote unquote race. It had to do with the particular mentality that a particular group of people, in this case Romans, had. Okay, is a Roman a race? No, it's not a race. Or okay, well, what race is it part of? See, nowadays the Romans, so let's say they're talking about the Vandals. Okay, so even the term Vandals, these were a group of people. They come in. They had the whole term of vandalizing came from these group of people. They would come and they would just tear shit up. Okay, at least that was what people said. This is what they did. They were called barbarians. But these days, here, if those Vandals came here to the United States of America and lived here, and if Romans came here, I'm just saying, if we took them, we had a time machine, and they were living here in 2015. Here in the United States of America, we would call both of them white. Even though the Romans called them, you see my point here? Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the race concept is just a simplified way of describing somebody, but it's also used as a mechanism to divide as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I apologize for laughing, but whenever you really start to dissect the concept of race, you realize how silly it is. It is such a silly concept.
But I was just watching earlier on, I was just watching the episode 50. I would implore anybody to watch it. It's episode 50, Media Manipulation, Religion, Race, Religion and Sexual Orientation, that Lenon did. And you did a breakdown on there, which I was watching, which just made a complete mockery of the whole thing. Is you did me, and then you did your wife, and then you sort of said, right, my dad was from here, and was half this and half this, and Cape Verde, and I think is one of the places. And your wife's was sort of mother was half Native American, I believe. Anyway, it was along those lines. But I believe it was your wife's dad that you said that he was half European, white European, but he wouldn't admit it. I mean,
yes.
That's a.
Does that sound strange to you?
Well, no, it does sound strange when you think about it, when you work it out like that. But when you sort of think about how people have been manipulated to think about things, and how people have been manipulated to have an identity, to be able to stick to something rather than being just a member of the human race.
Yes,
being part of a different.
Yes, and then denying other aspects of your ancestry in the process, and even in some cases looking at that ancestry in a very negative light. In other words, that's a form of self-hate. My wife's father hated part of himself, in essence. This is the truth. See, and it sounds strange to a lot of people, but you all will be surprised, especially again, this issue of race in the United States of America. It really, in terms of the psychological impact it has had on people, people's minds get twisted. Okay, it's like the Lord of the Rings. It's like they get the one ring and their mind starts getting twisted. This concept of race is like a ring to rule them all. People need to be clear about this. Her father hated part of himself. See, he hated part of his ancestry, and he hated part of his own genetic makeup. And a lot of this comes out of this concept of race, that you have to self-identify with one of these groups and that you can't identify with any other group. See, in the United States of America, this is how ridiculous it is. You can have an ancestry wherein for the last 400, 500, 600, 6,000 years, your ancestry was of European descent. But if you marry someone who's African American and you have a child with that person, your child is black.
Yeah.
You see how ridiculous that is?
Yeah.
It is totally ridiculous. And in many cases, that child is raised to self-identify simply as being black or African American, and to deny all other aspects of their lineage, or of their genetic makeup, or of their ancestry. See, in our household, we don't do that. We don't do that. Okay? Now, most of the time, if people, depending on what topics I'm talking about, I'll identify with African Americans, because if I'm speaking on a particular topic that is very relevant to the African experience here in America for African Americans, there's a certain language that I use when I present, and I will self-identify for the purpose of those videos. However, in my everyday life, I don't necessarily walk around and say I'm African American. It's just not something that even comes to mind, because it's much more complex than that. So let me just give people an idea. If you don't know, my mother is part Filipino. Half Filipino and half Cape Verdean. Cape Verdean is off the coast of Senegal and West Africa. And so therefore it's really African. My mother is second generation here in the United States of America from her African ancestry. And, second generation here from second generation. And then from her Filipino or Asian ancestry, she is actually the first generation here. Okay. And my father, African American. His mother, his father is African American and Native American, and then his mother is Native American. Okay, so then my mother and my father get together and they have me, so I'm black. I'm African. You see, it's more complex than that, and I can't, as an act of self-love, I can't deny aspects of who I am, and I can't do that because it does a disservice. I mean, we talk in the African American community, we talk a lot about honoring your ancestors. At least a lot of us, we talk you should honor your ancestors. Yeah, okay, if we're going to do that, honor all of them. Don't pick and choose. Okay, you got to honor all of them. You got to honor who you are in totality and love yourself in totality for who and what you are. But the concept of race has us so twisted that we self-identify with one particular group of people, and then we negate everything else that takes place. In my wife's case, she's mixed with many different things, but in particular, her father is obviously he's mixed with someone something of European descent. But whenever my wife would ask him while he was alive, who was your father, he would never say. And whenever he would ask, what ancestry, he would never want to say. It was almost taboo. It was something that he perceived to be extremely negative and something not worth talking about. So here it is, and he's passed away recently. So here it is, my wife. She doesn't necessarily know at this point where that particular ancestry comes from, which would be nice to know. But she doesn't know that because her father self-identified with being African American and hated the other aspect of himself and didn't pass down that information to his own daughter in terms of her ancestry and her quote unquote genetic background. I think that that's significant. I think that everyone should know those types of things, and parents should pass that information down, not to define their child, but so that their child can have a better and broader understanding of where they come from, where their ancestry comes from. But if you see part of your ancestry as being bad or negative, or it's ugly, or it's not imbued with positivity, and then you deny it, then in essence what you're doing is you're hating an aspect of yourself. And that's why we're very careful. Not only do we've told our children, like, where based upon our knowledge, where our lineage comes from and all the different places around the world, literally all the different places around the world, we also are careful not to tell them that somehow you have to self-identify with simply one aspect. Now, if they want to do that later on in life, they can do that, and we'll support them on that. But we don't want them to feel that as if they have to do that because we say so.
A couple of interesting points here been raised in the chat room. I don't suppose you're familiar with a TV chef that we've got in this country called Ainsley Harriott, are you, Lenon?
No.
He's a black guy, and he was on some ancestry show where people go back tracing their ancestors, all done by the BBC, and he found his ancestors were slaves, but further back they were white slave owners, and he was actually quite gutted when he found that out. Mark also adds that I was told at a very young age by my father that he had to wait at the end of the street while his white friend went to get his football. He said that made my dad a better man and me for it too. So.
Yes, no, I understand. That's another dynamic too. The person that last message, are they from the UK or are they from the United States of America?
That Mark's from Manchester in England.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. Here in the United States of America, it wasn't too long ago either when that type of experience would be a normal experience. So they called it segregation. Okay. So, you couldn't use the bathroom. They had bathrooms for white people, bathrooms for black people. They had water fountains for white people, water fountains, and there would be signs that literally said for blacks, and there were, in some cases, there were restaurants that were only for, only white people could go in, and in some cases, black people can only come in through the back door. You see, this all comes out of this concept of race and this hierarchy, and somehow we are in competition. It's really a genetic competition. Okay, and it's foolishness because at the end of the day, when we make love, okay, when a man and a woman make love, regardless of what their genetic background is, a baby is going, as long as they're fertile, a baby is going to be produced. And yet we're so caught up on this concept of race that we go so far to discriminate against each other, to hate each other, in some cases to murder and maim each other, to enslave each other, all over this concept of race, which is an illusion in the first place. And yet when we come together and we have sexual intercourse as men and women, assuming that we're both fertile, what inevitably happens? Life itself. Something for people to think about.
Excellent. Oh, we've got a lovely comment there from Starfall Jones. He said, I admire the positivity of Lenon, how he maintains a euphoric smile even while elucidating on the most sinister and contrived elements of modern humanity. There's a lesson there.
Absolutely.
Well, that's an interesting observation. It's true, and one of the reasons why is because even the most demeaning topics and demoralizing topics can be addressed in such a way to where they're not overbearing. And so that's why I tend to infuse humor into things, and I like to smile, and because I want that energy to be present, because otherwise sometimes it can be too much, and I don't want people to walk away from anything that I talk about feeling disempowered. I want them to feel empowered. And so sometimes, it's necessary to maintain that smile. And y'all can hear it too when I talk. Sometimes I'll be smiling when I'm talking, and you can actually hear my smile. If you listen carefully enough, you can tell he's smiling while he's talking right now. I think that's a very important thing to infuse into the information that I share with people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so much easier to put your message across if you put it across with a little humour, because people tend to remember it a lot better.
Yes.
And let's face it, if you go to train for any kind of selling job, whether you're face-to-face or over the telephone, the first thing they teach you is smile. Even if it's over the telephone, people can hear whether you're smiling or
That's right.
not.
That's right.
I just wanted to make a point. When you were saying earlier on about how there's all sorts of different people from who've got genes and from different places, different areas of the world, and it all comes together. And when you know, like you said, your mother's Filipino, half Cape Verdean, which is Africa. But people would classify you as black, which would seem like a simplification, whereas the actual ultimate simplification would be just to say that you're a human being. Describe yourself as...
That's so right.
Without the manipulation, with the manipulation, you get the simplification to such a point, and then it stops, rather than going ultimately simple and saying, right, well, I'm a human being, you know, just like everybody else.
Yes, and taking it to that level, now we get into the brotherhood of humanity, because if everyone says they're a human being, now we don't have a reason to divide each other on, you know, based upon whatever race, economics, what have you. So if we're going to try to simplify, okay, well, why don't we simplify to the point where we see the brotherhood and the sisterhood, if you will, of all of humanity, simply by saying that I'm a human being. And part of that, too, it doesn't mean that we negate the fact that we come from different places and we have genetic makeup from different places, we have ancestry, because that's all beautiful, too. I think that we need to embrace all of that. But at the core and as an essential beings here on planet Earth, the idea that we are all part of a brotherhood, sisterhood of human beings, I think that should be the most, in its most simplistic form, and really in its most meaningful form. That's where we should get. And again, I'm not saying that we should deny our ancestry. What I'm saying is that if we're going to simplify on that level, then why don't we simplify to the lowest common, or really the highest common denominator. I want to say lowest, the highest common denominator, which is to recognize that we are part of this human species at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point there, Lenon, and I think this might perhaps be a good time to have a little break so we can all grab a drink or visit the bathroom if we need to, if that's okay with yourself and Jason.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll leave you with a song by Jeff Buckley, and we're back in a few minutes, folks. Lovely this song there, and I'd like to take this opportunity just to say a special thank you to all the people behind the scenes who help out at People's Internet Radio. There's a lot of people do a lot of work that you never hear anything of on air, and I'd like to dedicate that last song to Luby Lou, who's there in the chat room. She does some sterling work and helps me do what I do, and without her help, I couldn't possibly do it. Also, at People's Internet Radio, none of us get paid for doing this. It's all entirely voluntary. And if you like the work that we're doing, there is a donate button on the site, and it's just below the player in the main site window. And if you could just pop on there, and if you can spare a few pounds or a few hundred or a few dollars, euros, shekels, lotties, whatever you've got, it will be gratefully received and helps us keep doing what we're doing. Okay, Jason, I believe you've got something you'd like to bring up with Lenon for the second part of the show.
Yeah, I wanted us to sort of get into media manipulation, because that's really what got me hooked on your work, Lenon. And speaking to particularly the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, what I wanted you to do is, I wanted you to sort of give us your take on the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, but also it's important that you're as critical and you ask as many questions of the alternative media as you should do the mainstream media as well.
Yes. Absolutely. In my book, the 911 Fear-Based Mind Control Program, I outline why that's important. That it's not enough simply to be critical of the mainstream news and critical of the stories that are being presented, but also of the alternative news. And what I mean by being critical is that no matter what, you always demand evidence and proof to back up any given claim. So as an example, if it is proposed that SEAL Team 6 went in to assassinate Osama bin Laden, then you should ask the critical question, is there evidence and proof, or is there evidence that would prove that SEAL Team 6 went in to assassinate Osama bin Laden? And based upon that critical question, you go from there. And if people think about it, there actually was no evidence or proof provided. There was no evidence whatsoever provided that would prove that SEAL Team 6 actually went in to assassinate Osama bin Laden. And yet many people accepted this story, okay, as being true without asking critical questions and not even knowing if it's true or not. You got to ask the critical question to find out. And essentially, just in terms of media manipulation, how it works is oftentimes mass media will tell you, mainstream media and alternative media, they do this. They'll tell you what you are seeing. They tell you what is real. They tell you what you are to believe, but they don't provide evidence of proof. That's a problem, because as adults, critical thinkers, we should always demand evidence of proof. What many people accepted as being evidence of proof, and this applies to the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico as well, but what many people accepted as evidence of proof in terms of the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden was computer-generated images. And they would show these computer-generated images as if this is evidence of proof, as if this is actual video footage of SEAL Team 6 going in to assassinate Osama bin Laden. And then up in the upper left-hand corner, it would say virtual view. So you're basically being provided with a computer-generated image that is said to be virtual view, and you are told that this is the evidence that would prove that Osama bin Laden was assassinated by SEAL Team 6. And people the world over have accepted this particular story without any evidence or proof whatsoever. What's the difference between accepting that story and accepting, let's say, Santa Claus without any evidence? Is there really any difference? In my mind, there's not. When we talk about critical thinking, there is no difference. In both cases, we accept something to be true without having any proof provided for us. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The same thing applies to the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I have a documentary, Media Mind Control, in the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and what I do in that documentary is I engage in critical analysis. And I asked the question, is there any evidence that would prove without a shadow of a doubt that the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico was the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time? I'm going to say it again, that there is evidence that would prove that the BP oil spill is the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, as was propagandized within the mainstream and the alternative news. Now, I remember when the BP oil spill was taking place, and this was what, I think it was 2010. Let me go back and 2010, April 20th, 2010, when it started to come on the news and all of the stories and how everything seemed to be so dire. It was almost as if it was a global catastrophe, the way that it was being propagandized. Like this was potentially a doomsday-like scenario. This was how it was being propagandized. And a lot of people from around the world were succumbing to extreme levels of fear. There was someone in Europe, I remember, I was on YouTube, and he proposed that the oil, because there was so much out there, again, is there evidence and proof of this massive oil spill? I'm talking about clear-cut evidence and proof. If someone proposes that this is the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, what would be the evidence, the primary evidence that we would need to see in the first place? Massive amounts of oil. Did we actually see massive amounts of oil washing up on shore? No, we did not. Did we actually see massive amounts of oil all throughout the Gulf region? We did not. Within the tributaries? No, we did not. We did not see that. There was someone in Europe that had proposed that because of this massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that it was going to affect the jet stream and Europe was going to freeze over. And this video got hundreds of thousands of views and so many likes, and people were commenting, yes, this is so true, because people, again, they latch on to this doomsday-like scenario. It's a psychological issue. We have this tendency as a species at this point in our development to where when mass media proposes this dire situation, we accept it because for whatever reason we want our life to have purpose through massive death. In other words, if we can live through this massively traumatizing event, then somehow it'll give our life purpose. It's a psychological disorder that many people deal with. There was a time where I had the same type of mentality. I've transcended it over the years, but I had the same type of mentality. See, once you transcend that particular mentality and you start asking critical questions. So for me, when mass media, mainstream and alternative started to promote this as the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, they were saying we're waiting on the massive amounts of oil to wash up on shore. I'm not saying just a little bit of oil here and there. They're saying this is the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time and that we are expecting massive amounts of oil to wash up on shore. So when I'm hearing this and I'm waiting and they're saying they're waiting too, we're waiting for it. It's going to be there in a couple of days, and they're showing computer generated images. Okay. This is direction where the oil is headed. You can expect it to get here then. It's almost like the hurricane thing, what they show with the hurricanes. When the hurricane comes and they have this little thing and 2 hours in, 3 hours in, 4 hours in, same thing with the oil spill. They're saying this, but then no massive amounts of oil washed up on shore. Now there was some oil that was washing up in different places, but nothing extraordinary, no degree of oil that was any different than what you would see anywhere on the west coast of California on any given day. Because there's certain beaches out here you would not get in the water on any day, okay? And you will see the little oil floating up, and you can see it, okay? But for them to propose this as being the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, and I was sitting back day by day, waiting day by day, and I said, you know what? Something's not quite right about this. Because we are not seeing massive amounts of oil, coming up on shore, and then all they're showing us is this grainy footage of this oil wellhead that's spewing oil. But we don't know where that's located. We don't know how old that video is. We don't even know whether or not the video is repeating its own repeat. We have no idea to be able to ascertain that. So what I'm saying is that the video footage isn't necessarily indicative of the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. I'm talking about the oil head riser that was spewing oil. Now, it can be indicative of an oil spill, but the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, a doomsday-like scenario, absolutely not. No oil begins to wash up on shore. And I remember at a certain point, people in the mainstream news and in the alternative news begin to change the narrative. They use that term a lot. Whenever they use the term narrative, it's a narration, it's a story, it's a script, and they change the narrative. What they begin to say, and the question they begin to ask is, literally, where is all the oil? And then they have experts come on, trying to figure out why there's not all this massive amounts of oil washing up on shore. And there was all kinds of excuses from the mainstream news as an example. The oil was eaten up by microorganisms. That's why there's not any mass amounts of oil washing up on shore. Microorganisms ate it up. The oil went down deep into the ocean, okay? Because that's what oil does. It sinks, right? It doesn't come to the top. It always sinks to the bottom, okay? The oil came on shore. It actually did come on shore, but then it went underground. What do you mean? The oil came on shore and then went down under the ground somehow? I mean, these were the types of explanations that were coming out through the mainstream news to justify the lack of massive amounts of oil washing up on shore. And then the alternative news, they take it a step further. They say, yeah, well, there is a massive amount of oil, but the reason why you're not seeing is because Corexit is being used. But guess what? You should still be fearful because Corexit is it's toxic. It's chemicals that is very toxic to the human body. And as a consequence, potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. These are the types of stories that were coming out in the alternative news. Now, here we are all these years later. It's been about, 5 years now? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, did they die in the Gulf Coast region because of Corexit being used? Here we are 5 years later. Have we seen this mass amount of oil wash up on shore quite yet? Not yet. It won't. Why not? Because this was not the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. I'm not proposing that there wasn't an oil spill, but guess what? There was an oil spill today somewhere in the Gulf region. You best believe that. There was an oil spill somewhere off the coast of California. There was an oil spill on the highway today with the cars leaking oil, but this doesn't make it the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. This is what I mean by asking critical questions. In the absence of the proof, the evidence to prove any given claim, we should ask even deeper questions. And see, what mass media did was they propagandized this particular event or even non-event as being the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. And what does this do? It stimulates fear in people. Okay, fear is really what mainstream news tends to bring out, in alternative news tends to bring out in people. I call it fear profit. See, a story is only as relevant to the degree to which it can bring forth fear in people. So that's why you always hear stories about death, destruction, war, and gore. Death, destruction, war, and gore. BP oil spill is an excellent example. Again, being propagandized as the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. I have a saying, time always tells the truth. Here we are 5 years later, and there are people who are still waiting on the oil. There are people who are still waiting on tens of thousands, 100,000s of people to die because of Corexit supposedly being used. What mentality must we have as a human being to be waiting on death and destruction 5 years later? If it didn't happen then, it's not going to happen now. Time always tells the truth. The difference, I think, in terms of today is that people should have enough sense based upon their experience with the BP oil spill and all the propaganda that was associated with the BP oil spill as the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. We should have enough sense this time around that whenever mass media, whether it's mainstream news or the alternative media, presents us with a story, we should ask critical questions. Who, what, where, why, when, and how? Is there any evidence to prove this particular claim? If there is evidence to prove, okay, I can accept it. If there is not, then I can't accept it as being true. To do otherwise, to simply accept the story as being true, without any evidence to prove a particular story to be true is no difference in accepting Santa Claus as being true without any evidence that would prove that Santa Claus is true.
A similar sort of thing with Fukushima.
Absolutely.
Yep. The radiation, we're all going to be radiated. Mm-hmm. We're all, and the alternative websites that were pushing this propaganda, that were saying, you know, that there's going to be radiation coming. Wasn't it supposed to hit California first? It was going to engulf California, the whole radiation. And right next to the story, you've got, was it iodine that they were selling? That, you know, right. Going to protect people from the you know. So it's like you say, it's we call it fear porn, don't we? Really?
No, it is. That's what it is. Yeah, it is. It's fear porn. Yeah, and that's another example. Fukushima, and I live in California. There were news stories that were coming on that was telling people, look, there's fallout. There's potential fallout, and you have to be very careful. And, you know, on the West Coast, on the coastline, the iodine pills sold out. So there's a lot of people who profited off of that. Same thing with these alternative news websites. They're selling iodine pills. They're also selling gas masks for some reason. Okay, you got to protect yourself from radiation. It's so ridiculous. It gets so ridiculous that one of the things that they proposed in mainstream news was that if you do have to go to work, make sure you wash your car off before you get inside of it. So what they're saying is, are you hearing me on that? In other words, before you get in your car, because this radiation is coming, and while you're in your house, you're not going to be affected. But if you have to get out and get into your car, that means your car has been outside. It's been subject to the radiation. So what you want to do before you get into your car is to water your car down and then get into your car, and now you're going to be just fine. And there were people who went and did this. It's not intelligent. It's not rational. But why did people do that? They did it because of fear. See, the idea is you take any given story, you exaggerate it. It can even be a false story, but you exaggerate it. You make it a doomsday-like scenario. Death, destruction, war, and gore. You make it a doomsday-like scenario, and then you modify people's behavior by inciting fear in them. See, you traumatize them. Trauma brings forth fear. Fear brings forth the externalization of power. And once a person externalizes their power, you can control them indefinitely. This is precisely how mass media work, whether it's mainstream news or alternative news. And there's so many other ones. We just talked about BP oil spill. We just did Fukushima, but there's plenty of other ones. The Fukushima propaganda was so deep. They were also saying things like all of the debris from the tsunami was going to come over to the West Coast, meaning, and I live in California, I'm on the West Coast. It was going to come all the way across the Pacific, and then once, like the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, it was going to come and begin to inundate the West Coast, and we're going to have all of this, I don't know what they were saying, millions of tons of debris from, you know, the tsunami is going to come, and it's going to inundate the West Coast. We have to be prepared for that. We have to have our cleanup crews ready, so forth and so on. People are still waiting for that to come.
I saw another classic example of the changing narrative of the mainstream media when Russia decided to join in with this, I'll give it air quotes, ISIS eradication program. And first of all, my partner read out to me, because I try and avoid mainstream news like the plague. She read out this story, Russia are bombing ISIS. And then a few minutes later, the story changed. Oh no, Russia are not bombing ISIS at all. They've made a mistake. They're bombing the Free Syrian Army. And then a couple of days later, we saw some aerial footage of the bombing raid, the first bombing raid. And I said, that looks a bit dodgy. And then it came out a couple of days later, it was actually footage from a video game. Mm-hmm. But that was broadcast on mainstream news, and yeah, here we go, we got footage of the bombing.
That's right. That's right. They did the same thing with the supposed assassination of Osama bin Laden. They would show a computer generated image, and then they would basically overlay video footage of SEAL teams shooting. But these SEAL teams, okay, this is a special op unit. This is basically stock footage. Okay, so they superimpose the stock footage as if this is actual footage of SEAL Team 6 going into, and then on top of that, after that they show, you know, the computer generated image of SEAL Team 6 and Osama bin Laden and so forth and so on. So this is what we mean by media manipulation. You can actually, again, if mass media, if they're telling you that you're seeing something, and most people aren't going to ask a critical question, even if you're seeing something, and now, is that actually what they're showing me? Is that really Russia doing this? Is that really, and how do I know this to be true? And in some cases, they do show video games. That's the other thing I talked about, the blurring of the lines between fantasy and reality nowadays, this is going to be more of a problem as we continue to progress, because we have two generations now that have been raised on video games, and the video games now are so lifelike that there's a blurring of the lines between what is real and what is not. And so what's going to happen at a certain point is that the individuals who are being inundated with the video games that are so lifelike, okay, especially the first-person shooter games, when they come of age, I expect this to take place when they come of age, let's say 20 years from now, or we can say 15 years from now, the types of media stories that are going to be presented can actually be perceived to be verifiable simply by using computer-generated images and video footage from video games. Because there's a blurring of the lines, and they've been programmed for much of their life to associate the video games that they're playing with reality. So you can give them video game footage and say, this is what you're seeing. You're actually seeing Russia bombing, okay, ISIS or what have you, and people will accept it as being true. This is one of the problems in terms of where technology is getting in this overlay. It's almost as if the blurring of the lines between the fantasy realm and digital graphics, so forth and so on, with reality. And people more and more nowadays are accepting digital graphics, which come out of computer-generated images that you can create on your computer, and they're beginning to accept it as being an accurate representation of reality, when in point of fact it's not. I should also mention that ISIS, a lot of the footage and I would actually propose that all of the footage that they show of ISIS, in many cases, all they show is a flag. Okay, it's that black flag. ISIS was here. Okay, wait a minute. Does that mean that anyone can plant a flag? That doesn't mean that ISIS was there. But ISIS, in terms of the Toyota trucks that they're riding on, they have the Gatling gun on the back. They have in many cases, they have that. It's a white Toyota truck with the red stripes on the side. Mm-hmm. I was talking about this 4 years ago with the Syrian rebels and the Libyan rebels. Same white Toyota trucks with the red stripes on the back with the Gatling guns. And I was calling it out then. I was saying, look, this is just stock footage that they're playing over and over again. And here we are all these years later, and they're doing the same thing with quote unquote ISIS. This is all propaganda. So in other words, you can show a flag. Okay, you can have the flag, but you can show stock footage of video footage from these so-called ragtag rebels. Many of us forget about this. The ragtag rebels in Syria is a big thing back years ago. And then, of course, in Libya, the ragtag rebels riding around in Toyota trucks, white Toyota trucks with Gatling guns on the back with this red stripe on the side. And whenever I would say it, people would laugh back then because it was so obvious back then. Well, here we are all these years later. They're presenting the same propaganda, same imagery, and people are accepting it as being true. It's not true. It's called propaganda.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sorry, Jason. Jimmy has asked in the chat room, are you suggesting, Lenon, that there is no ocean contamination due to Fukushima?
No, I'm not proposing that. Just like I'm not proposing that there isn't any ocean contamination with the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. What I'm proposing is that what media tends to do is to take stories and exaggerate to the extreme. Mm-hmm. See, the notion that there's going to be nuclear fallout without any scientific basis for that, that's a problem. And then to incite fear in people, in particular here in the United States of America, here in California, as a result of a non-scientific proposition that is basically rooted in propaganda, that's a problem too. Same thing with the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't oil spill. There's an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico today. I can guarantee you that. People can look up how many oil wells they actually have, and there's a whole lot of them out there. You can expect there's going to be an oil spill someplace every single day, even if it's just a leak or if it's something that's significant, much more than a leak. There's going to be a leak. The problem is that mass media tends to take any given story and, if possible, will manipulate it and turn it into some extremely catastrophic event, when it's unnecessary to propose it as being such. And then there's no evidence to prove that it is the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time, or that there's going to be nuclear fallout to such a degree that people need to wash their cars and people need to get iodine pills. You see, that's what I'm suggesting here.
Lenon, when somebody reads or sees on the news a story, if they can not react with emotion and fear and things like that, what are the critical questions they should ask themselves about that particular story and whether or not it's credible?
Yes, okay. Again, I always go down this list: who, what, where, why, when, and how. So who's telling me this? Okay, are they reliable? Okay. These are critical questions. As an example, in the alternative media, they're notorious for proposing certain things that never come to pass. You know, war with Iran is going to happen. I can feel it. Or World War III. I mean, they've been talking about, or the Amiral is going to come into fruition here in the United States of America. There's people who are propagandizing that, and they were saying that was going to happen back in 2008. Okay, here we are all these years later, still hasn't taken place and probably won't be taking place. But the point is that you ask who, and are they credible? Okay, who's giving me this information? Are they sourcing sources? And when they source a source, do they actually give you a name of the source? Because this is another thing that the mainstream news and alternative media, they're very notorious for these days. You couldn't get away with this decades ago, but you can get away with it now with the 24-hour media cycle, wherein instead you can present a story and you can say that it's true, and you can say an official says that this story is true. Okay, but who's the official? Or they'll say the experts. Experts say that this, or an official in the White House, an official who is speaking under anonymity. Mm-hmm. Sources say, experts say, doctors say, lawyers say, yeah, but who are these people? So that I can go back and verify. See, you can't go back and verify. So I'm proposing to anyone, if you can ask the question, who's giving me this information? Are they credible? And if they're sourcing someone to provide the credibility to the story, are they actually giving you a name? If they give you a name, can you go and look into that person and see for yourself whether or not that person said what that person said? See, if they don't give you a name, then why would you simply accept what they're saying as being true? When they're basically, their whole premise and what they're reporting on is predicated in terms of the validity of what they're reporting on is predicated on this source, on this expert. But the source of the expert doesn't have a name. You don't know who this person is. And I'm going to propose something to you all. These days, a lot of those sources are fictional. A lot of those experts are fictional. There's not actually experts or officials that, presented any of this information. That, in other words, the script writers, people who write the scripts, they're called producers for a reason. They literally write this stuff. It's news. It's entertainment. So always ask who. You ask what. What is this story about exactly? Does this story make sense? I mean, if this is the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time and there's no mass amounts of oil washing up, this doesn't make any sense. Who, what, where? Where is this taking place? When they show me the video footage and they say that it's at a particular location, is there any way that I can conclusively say that this is actually where they say it's taking place? Okay, are there landmarks that I can see? Is that oftentimes what happens is video footage is cropped in very closely so that you don't have an expansive view of what's taking place around that particular area, so there's no way that you can actually tell. Again, these are just some critical questions. Who, what, where, why? Okay, why are they reporting on this story? Let me give an example of why this is relevant, because oftentimes a lot of the stories that are presented in cycles. For instance, every single year within the 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, you start to get stories in the news about terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS. You know, Osama bin Laden is back in the news, Pastor Terry Jones, plane problems, plane crashes, stories about Ground Zero, anything that has to do with the plane crash is in the news because all this has a subliminal association with September 11th. So in those 6 weeks leading up to September 11th, you start to get these types of stories. Who, what, where, why? Why are these stories coming up? Oh, we're getting close to September 11th. Okay, and the Oslo terror attacks, okay, what they call the twin terror attacks, like Twin Tower attacks. They call it Oslo's 9/11. When you get into that anniversary, you start to hear stories about that. Okay, why are these stories being presented? Oh, because the anniversary is coming up here shortly. This is cyclical programming in media. I talk a lot about this inside my book, The 911 Fear-Based Mind Control Programming. Who, what, where, why, when, how? How is this? This is an important question. How is this story being presented? Okay, does it have spooky music in the background? You know, is all the imagery that they're showing, is it kind of dark and the little graphic overlays are all red and you know, it makes me fearful? How is it being presented to me? Is it being presented to stimulate my intellect, or is it being presented to stimulate my emotions, in particular negative emotions that are associated with fear? You see, you can ask who, what, where, why, when, how. Another question, is there any evidence of proof? One of the most important questions anyone can ever ask is there any evidence of proof? There has to be conclusive evidence of proof, because otherwise you will accept the story as being true simply based upon what someone else is telling you. And that's not enough, in my opinion. I think as critical thinkers, and just as human species, I mean, we've been imbued with this ability to think critically. We should use that faculty. We should take the time to ask questions like, is there any evidence that would prove this to be true? And what you will find that if you ask for the evidence while you're viewing from the mainstream news or the alternatives, much of the time, not all of the time, because sometimes stuff is verifiable and that's great, but much of the time, I'll even propose most of the time, there's actually not any evidence of proof. An official saying that they say the official says, that's not evidence of proof, because the official it's ambiguous. Experts say, officials say, and someone in the White House says, I have an official in the White House who said, that's ambiguity. That's not definitive. How can you accept something that is ambiguous and not definitive as being evidence? You see? Okay, so these are just some of the questions that we can ask. I can go on and on and on this particular topic, but the idea is the more questions you ask, the better.
And also perceived relevance as well. That is another.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Let me speak on that one. Thank you for bringing it up. At the end of the day, okay, even if there's evidence of proof that, you know, actually you have proof of any given claim given to you by the mainstream or the alternative news, you always have to ask the question, is this relevant to me? You see, is this really relevant to me? I mean, I had someone who emailed me from it wasn't the UK, some place, Eastern Europe somewhere, but I can't even remember where it was. And they were upset about my documentary, Me, the Mind Control, and the BP Oil Spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Here we are, time has told the truth. We're 5 years later, because this person basically was saying that I was wrong, and you just wait, the oil's going to come, and just wait. Well, I'm still waiting, bro. I mean, how much longer do I need to wait? Okay. The point is, here's someone who lives on the other side of the planet, and they perceive, because of propaganda, they perceive the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico to be relevant to them. Wait a minute. Is it really relevant to you? In the first place, is the propagandized story true in the first place? Okay, time has told the truth on this already. People go check out my documentary, Me, the Mind Control, and BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I even provide evidence in terms of doctored photos that mass media use to propagandize this story as being the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. And I give examples of this. Not only do I give examples of it, I also take some of my own pictures. I mean, I went through great depths for this particular documentary. I take my own pictures and I said, can you tell me whether or not this particular picture is from the BP oil spill? And a lot of people, they were going through this exercise. I don't know, I think it was like 25 pictures, and they got so many of them wrong. They assumed that certain pictures were from the BP oil spill and some were not, but a lot of the ones that they thought were from the BP oil spill, those were the ones that I took. Okay, but if I tell you that these are pictures from the BP oil spill and you accept it as being true, then without critical thought, you'll accept the pictures that aren't even from the BP oil spill as being from the BP oil spill. The point is this, that this individual had accepted the propagandized story that the BP oil spill was the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time without any evidence of proof. Even to this day, we don't have proof that proves without a shadow of doubt that the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico was the greatest ecological catastrophe of our time. But they were holding on to this belief that it was without the evidence of proof, without asking the critical questions, and they get upset at me. And this is someone on the other side of the planet. So even if it was true, is it really relevant to you? That's the question. Now, some people may say, okay, maybe they are. Maybe they are eco-conscious and they're into the environment. Okay, I understand that. But what I am saying is that just because mass media propagandizes a particular story does not mean that it's relevant to you. And I would also propose that if there is no evidence or proof to back up any given claim, we shouldn't accept it as being relevant because, in essence, we haven't proven it to be true in the first place. So in other words, if we accept something that's not even provable, that's not even true, we can't say that it's true, why would we say that it's relevant to us? See, that's not logical. Okay, we got to think critically about these things and use intellect. When we use intellect as opposed to succumbing to the emotions, because what people do, and this is the last point, what people tend to do is whenever the story is brought up, you know, war with Iran over and over again forever. Okay, they've been saying this forever. War with North Korea. Okay, and Ahmadinejad. Okay, you know, BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, greatest ecological catastrophe. What people tend to do is react emotionally out of fear, and fear compromises the intellectual process. When you are fearful, you can't think straight. People think about it. When you're fearful, can you really think critically about what's going on? No, you're either in fight or flight. It's a subconscious mechanism that we all have as a human species that when you go into fear mode, it's either fight or flight. You're not thinking. Okay, you're not critically thinking. You're just reacting. And what people tend to have, the reaction that people have is that fear. The fear compromises the intellectual process, and therefore people don't ask critical questions. Well, I'm going to tell people, don't approach information that way. Okay, there's a difference. I call this, you do not allow the information to master you. You master the information. And one of the ways that you master the information is you don't succumb to the fear. You ask critical questions, and after everything is said and done, whether the story, if you accept it as being true or not, you ask the critical question, is this even relevant to me?
Superb. Right, okay. I mean, we're sort of getting on with time here, and really, I wanted to get into your next project that you're working on at the moment. It's a documentary about NWA, I believe. So, if you'd just like to sort of give us some sort of idea as why you're making a documentary about NWA. I think it's a critical analysis, isn't it, of NWA's music?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you would take it from there.
Yeah, so in particular, it's about their lyrics, and I want to make the distinction between their music and their lyrics. A lot of their music was based upon sampled music that predates NWA. NWA, by the way, stands for Niggas with Attitudes. This was a quote-unquote gangster rap group that was very popular, especially here on the West Coast, and actually became popular around the world. But in particular, early on here on the West Coast, coming out of Compton, California, which is, you can just say it's like a subdivision of Los Angeles. The point is that their music is one thing, but their lyrics is something else. And so I'm engaged in a critical analysis of the actual lyrical composition, because you can actually quantify, and that's very important. You can actually engage in an analysis of the lyrical content, which people tend not to do, especially when it comes to music. We tend to just listen and enjoy, but why don't we think critically about the actual lyrics that we're listening to? And the idea is that, and lyrics are important because when we talk about the message oftentimes in most cases it's delivered in the lyrics. Okay. You can actually project a message without lyrics too, but there is a certain type of impact that lyrics actually have because you're dealing with words. Okay. And people can interpret those words in a particular way, as opposed to for instance, doing an instrumental and playing something, and maybe you're playing in a minor key and it's somber. So you're kind of expressing sadness, and people can pick up on that. But in essence, it's subjective, because one person may hear it as being sorrowful, but someone else may hear it to be something else, right? But when we talk about lyrics, it's tangible. This is something that you can actually look at, you can write down, and you can actually analyze. In other words, it's quantifiable, and if done properly, scholastically speaking, if you engage it from a scholastic type of orientation or as a scholar, you can come to the analysis from the vantage point of objectivity, and that's very, very important. So what I decided to do was to engage in a critical analysis of NWA's Niggas with Attitudes, their lyrics. And the reason why is because recently they had a biopic. They call it a biopic. It's a film, a movie that came out titled Straight Outta Compton, and in worldwide success. Okay, hands down. I actually went to go see the movie. I'll say that in terms of production value, cinematography, they did a fantastic job. But the problem is that when people think critically about the lyrics of this particular rap group, there's so much there that we need to take a critical look at. And the other problem is that the movie really functioned as propaganda to glorify the group, so that the next generation would go back and listen to their music. And a lot of young people have gone back to listen to their music without the critical thinking skills necessary to engage in critical analysis, because if you look at the lyrics critically, you'll find some very staggering things. So let me just share with you all some of the things that I found, and let me give you the methodology. What I've done up to this point is I went through their 4 albums. Their first one was in 1987. They did another one in 1988. Then they re-released the first album in 1989. They did another album in 1990 and another album in 1991. So in total, they did 4 albums of music. And when I was growing up, I think the first time I heard NWA, I was about 12, maybe 13 years old. And this particular group, when they came onto the scene, what they did was, it was unheard of. Not only the language that they used, but the types of things that they were describing, the general themes that they were presenting then, and even today, I think a lot of people would agree, but then in particular, because at that time period, we just didn't see anything like that coming out of hip hop. It was, for a lack of a better term, it was some of the most degrading, demoralizing, and disrespectful lyrical content that had come onto the scene up to that point in hip hop, and potentially, it's made me possible, ever. Just doing the lyrical analysis. What I did was I went back and I listened to every single track over and over and over again. I listened to track by track each album, all 4 albums, each track. Some tracks I had to listen to 15 times. Some I listened to 20, 25 times. And what I did was I began to calculate what were the words that were being repeated over and over again. Because again, the idea for critical analysis, we want to get to what were the general themes, what was the message or messages that were being presented in this music. Messages that when I was 12 or 13, I didn't think critically about. See, I want people to understand something, that when we are children, we tend to operate based upon our subconscious mind, and our subconscious mind tends to accept things without a filter. And so you can literally this is what mind control is on a certain level. Subconscious mind control. You can literally program a particular person by repeating things over and over to them. Like you can tell them a lie, and if you repeat it enough, they begin to believe that it's true. There are parents who told their children that Santa Claus is real, which is a lie, but you tell them it enough over years, months, years, some cases days is enough, but years, you tell them it over and over again, they believe it to be true. And what happens is it changes how the child begins to think. It also changes their behavior. This is the critical thing. The behavior modification that takes place when this lie is repeated over and over and over again. So lyrics are important, because if lyrics are being repeated and certain words are being repeated over and over again, this constitutes programming for the subconscious mind. And as a consequence, the programming that is submerged in the subconscious mind begins to enact a level of behavior modification. Individuals begin to change their behavior based upon the programming that is there inside the lyrics. Okay, so I hope this makes sense to people. I'll be outlining all this inside the documentary. So I want people to imagine if young impressionable girls and boys who are operating based upon the subconscious mind mainly, because there is this transition that we tend to make from childhood coming into adulthood, where we begin to transition from subconscious programming mainly to coming into a level of consciousness where we begin to think critically. The idea is that we want to get these babies and our children thinking critically at an earlier and earlier age, as opposed to arrested development, where it takes, like me in my case, I've reached 28, 29, then I start to critically think. That's a problem. Okay, that's a serious problem. The idea is we want to get that transition early on, but imagine these young people, boys and girls, and in particular here in Southern California, in the African American community, who do not have the type of filtering mechanism within their community, whether that is through their parents or through their, in general, just within their communities, a filtering mechanism to be able to ask critical, and then not have the intellectual faculties at that age to really ask critical questions about what they're listening to, but then concluding, okay, as a critical thinker, whether or not they're going to adopt that programming as their own. And a lot of people adopted the programming of NWA as their own. I should also mention that this programming comes out in and around the height of what is called the drug war here in the United States of America. And the drug war really was a war that was perpetuated against impoverished African Americans, because impoverished African Americans were the target of the drug war. So the idea, and this comes out of Reaganomics and Ronald Reagan, the idea is that there's this massive issue of drugs and crack and all this type of thing. And so we have to go in and we have to deal with these people, these criminals. But really the people that they targeted the most were people who were living in the inner cities or in the hoods or in the quote unquote ghettos, and specifically targeting African American males, African American people, but males in particular. Okay, this is amazing. I mean, when we talk about race relations in the United States of America, because it's not as if African American folk were doing drugs any more than quote unquote white people were doing drugs. In point of fact, I propose, just because of population distribution, that there at any given moment there's more white people who are doing drugs than African American people. But most people don't think that way because of the media propaganda that was coming out of Reaganomics. So the point is that you have this war on drugs, which is really directed at African American communities, impoverished communities in the ghettos, and specifically at African American males. But then at the same time, we get this media programming coming out of NWA that was basically designed to program African American males, African American people, but African American males in particular, to be criminal minded, to set them on course for criminality, to set them on course to become part of what is called and known as the prison industrial complex. So this is why it's important to dissect this now, because to indoctrinate the next generation into the same type of programming, this really should cause everyone to take a moment to think. Let me do this. Someone just had asked, what's take on the timing of the prison industrial complex and the change of underground hip hop? I think I just explained that just now. Right?
I think you did, yeah. Okay. I think I saw that in the chat box. So
but this is an excellent question, and I'll be outlining this inside the documentary too. People can check out the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I literally finished this book today, one of the best books I've ever read. That's why it's fresh on my mind. I'll outline this in the documentary, the timing at which NWA comes out, and then when we look at the programming, really it's in line with this this greater agenda to criminalize African American males and put them in a situation wherein they are ultimately incorporated into the prison industrial complex. So, based upon my lyrical analysis, going by track, album by album, listen to each track over and over and over again, this was not an easy task, because the types of things that we're saying, things that as a child I adopted, I didn't really think critically about, but as a grown man now, 39 years old, 5 children, been, me and my wife been together for 14, almost 15 years now, and I conduct myself as an honorable man every single day. I believe in that. I believe in living an honorable life. That's just how I live. I believe in that. To have to go back and listen to this type of music and to analyze it was no easy task. 4 albums of music, NWA, the major themes, 48 tracks, 3 hours and 9 minutes, 44 seconds. The major theme, 553 instances of disrespect of women. That's the major theme. So I want people to think about this. If just in 3 hours and 9 minutes of playtime, you hear the disrespect of women 553 times, how does that impact a young impressionable boy? How does that impact a young impressionable female or girl for that matter? You see what I'm saying? How does that impact the self-esteem of the young girl? Okay, how does that impact the manner in which the young boy, in particular the young African American boy, begins to perceive male-female relationships, how he sees women, how he sees the young girl? You see my point here. And just imagine imagine this, that if just in 3 hours and 9 minutes of music, which isn't a lot of time, you have 553 instances of the disrespect of women, in particular African American or black women. What if this child listens to those 4 albums twice? Okay, now we're getting into the thousands. What if they listen to it 4 times? All these albums 4 times. Okay, now we're getting into the 2000s. 2,000 instances, over 2,000 instances of disrespect of women. So what if over the course of, let's say, 5 years, they listen to these albums over and over and over again, these songs over and over again, again, this particular theme of disrespecting women, which comes in many different forms, how does that begin to impact their mentality? And then how does that modify, ultimately, their behavior as a mind control program? You see, so the implications are quite staggering when we really think about it. And this is just one area. We talk about male-female relationships. As an example, too, or a couple of examples of the disrespect of women, this can materialize in terms of how women are referred to, skeezers, bitches, hoes, sluts, this type of thing. Disrespect of women in terms of how women are, sexualized content. In fact, in their music, they glorify rape. In their music, they glorify what we call running a train. This is when a group of males, in this case African American males, have sex with one female, and in this case, in terms of the lyrical composition, in the back of a car, and the young girl is 14 years old. Okay, this is when we talk about programming. Okay, how does that impact the young impressionable boy that does not have the intellectual faculties to critically think about that, but doesn't have a filtering mechanism? Maybe his father's not there. Maybe his mother is unaware of what he's listening to. Maybe his friends are listening to it and they're co-signing, you see. So the major theme within NWA's music, when we talk about disrespect of women coming in many different forms, including promoting and glorifying rape, promoting and glorifying pedophilia, promoting and glorifying living a sexually promiscuous lifestyle, calling women bitches and hoes, so forth and so on, the preeminent theme presented within NWA's music was the disrespect of women in general, disrespect of black women in particular, 553 times. And that's just in 3 hours and 9 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. To be more specific, 3 hours, 9 minutes, and 44 seconds. How many of y'all knew that, by the way? And did they say anything about that inside the movie Straight Outta Compton? And yet, what happened is a lot of younger people went back to listen to NWA, and what they're receiving is the programming to disrespect women in general and black women in particular. The use of the term nigga 385 times. Okay, and in this case, the use of the word nigga not as a term of endearment like many people say these days. It's a term of endearment. And again, I grew up using this language. This is the language of my childhood. Nigga, fuck you, motherfucker, I don't give a shit, all that stuff. Okay, I grew up with that. But that's not a legacy that I'm passing down to my children by any stretch of the matter. It's not going to happen. The use of the term nigga, not as a term of endearment, even though that in and of itself isn't legitimate to me, but used as a term of disrespect 385 times. The self-aggrandizement of the rapper in NWA, okay, whether that's MC Ren, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, or Eazy-E. Self-aggrandizement simply means to make yourself appear to be better than what you are. And usually how that is accomplished is by disrespecting or demeaning and demoralizing other people. This is called the playing the dozens. It's a form of self-hate. And this is one of the major themes within NWA's music is self-hate, meaning you hate other African American or black people. The use of, and let me go through this quickly here. Using the term bitch, calling women bitches 208 times in just 3 hours and 9 minutes. People just imagine you sit down for 3 hours and 9 minutes and you hear this group calling women bitches 208 times. The use of the term fuck, the general use like fuck you 198 times, motherfucker, which is a derivative of fuck. This is one of my favorite words growing up. Motherfucker 197 times. Not only the disrespect of women or black women, but also the disrespect of men. Okay, black men 193 times. It's another major issue in the African American community, which is an expression of self-hate, which is something that we don't like to talk about. Again, these are the major themes presented in their lyrics based upon a lyrical analysis and word counts. This is quantifiable. Anyone can go and do this. I mean, if you're courageous enough to listen to this over and over again, you can actually come up with these figures, and your figures will come close to be comparable to mine here. 134 times use of the term shit. And again, where I come from, these terms aren't necessarily perceived to be disrespectful, but understand that in 1987, 88, 89, these types of words were very much taboo to be expressed in this type of way. So people have to understand this, that this was almost like social engineering. Nowadays, it's not as big of an issue, but back then, these were like, oh wow, I can't believe they're using these terms in this music. References to the penis, which they call it the dick or the tip, 96 times. References to guns, 93 times. The heavy gun culture and propagandization of the use of guns, okay, usually to kill and murder other African Americans inside of their music, 93 times. Disrespect of other rappers, 91 times. General violence against black men, 88 times. Okay, so the general violence against, quote unquote, African American people happened inside their lyrical compositions, 88 times. And this is just again in 3 hours and 9 minutes. References to drugs, 87 times. References to sex, usually expressed we're using the word fuck, 86 times. That's one of the major themes presented within their music, which goes along with the disrespect of women, and that is to live a sexually promiscuous lifestyle. So again, the drug culture, living a sexually promiscuous lifestyle, committing violent acts against other African American, quote unquote, black on black crime. This is part of the repetitive nature of the lyrical composition. And just think about this, ladies and gentlemen, as I expressed earlier on, all of this sets up a criminality, a mental, how can we say, a criminal mindedness as a program. And this is all at the height of the war on drugs, which was about criminalizing African American males in particular, and setting them up so that they would ultimately be incorporated into the prison industrial complex. References to alcohol, 86 times. Negative references to females' bodies, 82 times. References to money, 78 times. Using the term fuck the police, which people think is revolutionary, but if you think about it, saying fuck the police is not going to solve the issue of police brutality. And if anything, it's going to cause police to be more brutal. If you say fuck the police, just as an intellectual process for people to think about it, because a lot of people have this misconception that somehow they were revolutionary and that they were fighting against racism simply by saying fuck the police. That's not going to solve any problems. If anything, that's going to exacerbate the problem. It's going to make matters worse. The police officers who were already abusive, they become more abusive because you're saying fuck you. The police officers that weren't abusive, they may be more inclined to be abusive to you, and this all filters into the prison industrial complex in the war on drugs. People think about that, and even deeper still, simply saying fuck the police 52 times while you're engaged in general violence against your own people 88 times, African American males, you're involved in terms of lyrical composition, you're committing general violence against black males 88 times. Do the math. And then if you look at how many times they committed abusive acts or violent acts against black women inside their lyrical composition, I think that the figure is altogether 119 instances wherein NWA in their lyrical composition, which is quantifiable, are engaged in criminal behavior or violent behavior towards their own people 119 times, and then they say fuck the police 52 times, and somehow they're revolutionary. Okay, so these are just some of the examples. I got about another page and a half worth of the major themes that were all presented within their discography in the lyrical composition. What I'm going to be doing in my documentary is outlining the implications of these lyrics as programming, in terms of society as a whole, how it impacted the psychological development of young African American males, in particular, how it impacted their relational dynamics, how they begin to relate to African American women or African American girls if they were younger, how that has impacted the family structure, how that has also impacted the African American community via the incorporation and mass incarceration of African American males through the war on drugs. See, this programming fits right in with the scope of criminalizing African American males in their mind, mental criminalization, okay, to give them a mental outlook of criminalization and glorifying it. It's one thing to say these things are taking place in the hood, and this is what we need to solve these issues. It's another thing to say these are the things that are taking place in the hood, and we're going to glorify it. Because the glorification is indoctrination, and there were African American males who began to adopt this mentality, this criminal mentality, and then they began to change their behavior, and as a consequence, to this day, they are incarcerated. I have friends, I have relatives too, okay, and in many cases, set them on course for premature death. So my documentary will outline the sociological implications, amongst other things, in terms of NWA's lyrics, and I also have speakers that I will be interviewing in the documentary, and I will be providing my full analysis of the lyrical content. So the documentary is NWA, A Critical Analysis, and I hope to have it completed early 2016.
Okay, we're sort of like running out of time, aren't we, Andy? We're sort of like in those last five or 6 minutes. So in that time, Lenon, if you'd just like to tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your work, your films, and I believe that you're crowdfunding this NWA critique. So if you could perhaps let people know where they might be able to make a donation, just have a look at some of your work and see what's going on.
Yes. Okay, so if you want to look more into my work, I have various outlets. I have my website, LenonHonorFilms.com. That's where the earlier works dealing with media manipulation, my documentary work is listed there. I works on Walt Disney. I have a documentary, The Voyage Agenda 7 9, Sexualization of Technology. This is a critical analysis of the Star Trek universe, which is quite interesting in and of itself. Other documentaries there on the entertainment industry, the occult, so forth, so on. My other website is LenonHonor.com, and that's where most of my newer work is there. That's dealing more with manhood, fatherhood, positive relationships. We have premium membership there. We have my books are listed there as well. My wife, she has a cookbook that's listed there. That's on LenonHonor.com. I'm also on YouTube under Lenon Honor Films, and I upload there. I've been uploading a lot of updates about my current project, NWA Critical Analysis. So be sure to head on over to my YouTube page and subscribe there. I'm on Facebook. Okay, Facebook fan page, have a Facebook regular old page. Add me. I would appreciate that. I'm also on Twitter. And then, of course, I am doing a crowdfunding campaign right now for my documentary, NWA Critical Analysis, on Indiegogo. So if anyone's interested in supporting the work or getting more information, I have a video there that'll give you all the details about the documentary and a complete write-up. You can go to Indiegogo.com, and in the search engine there, you can type my name in, Lenon Honor, and my crowdfunding campaign will come up. We have 30 days left. We are 13% funded. I want to thank everyone who has contributed thus far, and I need everyone's support. So please, if you found anything of value with anything that I've said here and you would like to support this project, head on over to Indiegogo. Again, type my name in, Lenon Honor, LENONHONOR, into the search engine, and my crowdfunding campaign will come up, which is titled A Critical Analysis of NWA, and make your contribution today. I would really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Lenon. And I'd like to say a big thank you for coming on tonight. It's unfortunate we had the mix-up on Tuesday, but it's all worked out great tonight. You've certainly been very popular with the chat room. They've had a few good questions there for you and some very positive comments. And I'd just like to say that for the regular listeners, we are back tomorrow at 2 p.m. UK time, or 6 a.m. if you're on the west coast of America, like Lenon. And our guest will be Cliff Rockefeller, and I believe Cliff will be talking about hypnotism and how he's used hypnotism in dealing with the courts. So that should be a fascinating one. I'd like to say a big thank you to Jason firstly for introducing me to Lenon, and secondly for getting him on tonight and joining us and all the great questions he's asked Lenon. And I'd just like to leave you all with a little bit of John Lennon before you stay tuned for Martin Farrell, who's on at 9. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Lenon.
Thanks, Lenon. Thanks, Andy.
My pleasure.
And I
Thanks,
hope we'll be
Jason.
able
Take
to
care,
get you on again sometime soon, Lenon.
I look forward to it, Andy. Y'all take care. Peace.
Thank you. But good night, everyone.